Something really bizarre came out of the 2000s, that being the obsession with werewolves, vampires, zombies, and magic. Well, really anything supernatural. Hi, I figured I would have a little fun with this video because as a kid, growing up in the 2000s was catered to more gothic and alternative vibes. And this led to every piece of media focusing on the next blood-sucking, spell-casting, and flesh-craving culture to be discovered. Now, truthfully, this whole era of pop culture with the supernatural started to become a hit around the late 1980s and early 1990s alongside UFO and Bigfoot phenomena. But it would then become a major shift in the industry alongside the 2000s. And no, it's not all about Twilight, as there's so many other films, games, TV shows, and books that hit the shelves or air around that time. But I do need to mention that while that franchise is one of my faves, and I always rewatch the movies every year, it had me really looking back at how much we consumed all of these supernatural forces. Angel, which was a spinoff of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, really showcased all of these elements for that time, and between you and I, that show is my lifeline, but my card at the top will tell you that. There was not a place you could go that wasn't inspired by the undead or magic, and most music of the time, especially within rock and metal, really harped on that appeal or sound. So let's sink our teeth into the next part of this video, which is how and why we were so focused on werewolves, vampires, zombies, and magic. Before I get into how the supernatural world became an obsession in the 2000s, I know there will be people in the comments saying how certain books or films that they love were not in my video. And I just want to say, hey, let me have a little fun. While researching into the beginning of what we saw in the 2000s with everything supernatural, I noticed that some articles stated that media like Interview with the Vampire, Night of the Living Dead, or Harry Potter all jump-started this pop culture trend. And while I do see the influence behind these pieces of media, there is a big spin that hasn't been mentioned. The lore behind vampires, magic, werewolves, and zombies goes back years before the 2000s, hell even centuries, as a lot of films and books that released throughout the 1900s make a reference to that mythology. But the big spin to making this culture pop in the 2000s was music. It sounds stupid, but let me explain. Around the 1980s, goth culture was becoming a massive force, and with artists like Joy Division or New Order influencing the shift, the idea of the supernatural was becoming more than just a comedic prop. It was something that people could make darker and more lustful as what they were finding in books, or what they were hearing throughout that type of music. Tones would shift again in the 1990s, bringing in a new wave of new metal and grunge, or even industrial metal. These all had that same dark appearance, but in a modern take. I mean, just take a look at Korn or Deftones, and you will find the industry shifting to the supernatural world, especially under films like Queen of the Damned. This new sound in music would lead to the uprising of the undead in the 2000s. Alright, so we talked about what I found to be the shift in all things that go bump in the night. But what about all the culture the supernatural influence in the 2000s? There's going to be a lot to unpack here in a small amount of time, so let's rise from our graves or caskets and be reborn to the 2000s. So obviously the shift in music became the focal point with bangers like Waking the Demon by Bullet for My Valentine. Metal, industrial metal, and new metal were the hype of the culture. But truthfully, I need to quit mentioning music altogether and just talk about the media shift. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought us shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, or movies such as Blade and From Dusk Till Dawn to feed into this industry shift. As time went on, we got to see more unique backstories from movies like Underworld, which showcased the feud between werewolves and vampires. By the way, Michael Sheen, you are not sneaky, playing both a vampire and werewolf in 2 different franchises. But then we got an uprising of the undead through games and movies like Resident Evil and 28 Days Later. Speaking of games, while 2004 films like Van Helsing had their own adaptation under gaming consoles of that time, the industry was becoming saturated with zombie-like games such as Dead Rising or Left 4 Dead that were extremely popular. And we can't mention zombies without The Walking Dead that became such a cultural movement at the end of the 2000s. Then there was Twilight, which played with the idea of being in love with a vampire or werewolf, which looking back on it now is pretty toxic with all the mental gymnastics going on. Twilight was massive, like out of this world massive, and because of this movie, merch was everywhere and you could pick up vampire teeth from Hot Topic that glued onto your actual teeth, which wasn't pleasant to get off later. Ask me how I know. But then you had Harry Potter at the height of its success, which was competing next to Twilight. A lot of merch of that time was centered around vampires, werewolves, zombies, and magic, and you really couldn't escape it. I, myself, during that time was walking around school telling everyone I was Team Edward and a vampire, which looking back on it now was so cringe. But there was those type of communities that thought that they were vampires and werewolves, which to be honest is still somewhat of a thing. There's some really interesting clubs around the US that kind of showcase this thing. You even had forum pages on how to get your eye color to look hazel like Edward, which required your eyes to stare into a light bulb, and that has to be the biggest troll ever because that's just damaging your health. There were numerous books, other films, and TV shows that were not mentioned because either I haven't put them under my radar to consume or they were at the edge of the cultural shit. So I highly suggest leaving a comment on what supernatural content you were consuming of that time. But with all things that came out of the 2000s, this supernatural being would be left in the dust. The stake in the heart for this era would be another shift in the industry. As the 2010s came into the picture, music and culture was changing to less dark appearances and was focused more on realism. This led to more poppy tunes and relatability to what someone was facing. Sadly, this 2000s supernatural era has tried to resurrect through films and even TikTok, but it remains to be a nostalgia piece of the 2000s. Did you notice how much the industry used werewolves, vampires, zombies, and magic in the 2000s? And was it an important part of your childhood like it was for me? Twilight, Angel, and Dead Rising will forever be my comfort to the 2000s. A big part of making this video was just to have fun and mention what I noticed recently. But with that being said, make sure to stay out of the sunlight and try not to resurrect a dead with magic.